Good evening once again. I'm Chris Jansing, day 393 of the Biden administration. And President Biden has again rejected an executive privilege claim from Donald Trump. The move clears the way for the January 6th committee to see even more documents that Trump had tried to keep hidden. The president has ordered the National Archives to turn over Trump White House visitor logs. Those logs should give House investigators more details about who was coming to the White House before and after January 6th, and of course, on the day of the riot. The National Archives has told the former president that those documents will be delivered in 15 days, on March 3rd, unless there's a court order not to do so. In January, Trump lost his battle to keep other White House records out of the January 6th committee's hands when the Supreme Court ruled against him. The former president has made it clear where he stands on the Select Committee.
The Unselect Committee on January 6th. How about that committee? And Biden has the real scandals, and rest assured, when Republicans retake Congress, the Biden corruption will be investigated and exposed by Congress.
The Trump White House logs will be in addition to a growing pile of evidence already in the committee's possession. The Washington Post points out today just how critical text messages are to this investigation. The Post reports, quote, the panel has left a trail of newly released text messages between other players in Trump's inner circle beyond the 4,000 messages provided by Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, as it compiles communications from hundreds of individuals and entities who have cooperated with its investigation. The committee's trove includes texts from dozens of people, a committee staffer said. Earlier tonight, one committee member talked about why these texts are so important to the overall investigation.
First of all, who had access to the cell phone number for the chief of staff of the president of the United States? And then to look at, who were these people who were texting with the frequency? What did he respond to? It really does provide an insight into how the Trump White House was functioning and who had access to the people closest to the president.
Meanwhile, Oath Keepers founder Elmer Stewart Rhodes, who's pleaded not guilty to seditious conspiracy related to the Capitol riot, today tried to convince a federal judge that he should be let out of jail to wait for trial. Prosecutors argued against that, saying new evidence shows that Rhodes was behind a plot to continue to fight the transfer of power after the insurrection. Rhodes' defense attorney also revealed that his client told the January 6th committee earlier this month he still considers the 2020 election illegitimate. We're also following the latest on the ongoing crisis at Ukraine's border. NBC News reports a senior Biden administration official said no Russian troops were withdrawn from the border with Ukraine, disputing Moscow's claim that it was pulling back some forces. The official also said 7,000 troops have been added to the border in recent days. We will have much more with former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, a little later on. Meanwhile, here at home, COVID cases are falling and more states are dropping their mask mandates. The latest, Michigan. And NBC News reports the CDC could release new mask guidance as early as next week. But today, the agency was still sounding notes of caution.
We want to give people a break from things like mask wearing when these metrics are better, and then have the ability to reach for them again should things worsen. If and when we update our guidance, we will communicate that clearly.
With that, let's bring in our leadoff guest on this Wednesday night, Philip Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning senior Washington correspondent for The Washington Post. Carol Leonnig, the Washington Post Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter. Together, they wrote the New York Times bestseller, I Alone Can Fix It. And former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor. She hosts the podcast Sisters-in-Law. Good to see all of you. Carol, what might these White House logs actually show? Put them in the bigger context of the story that January 6th investigators are trying to tell.
Chris, it's such an important question because as January 6 investigators, both in the Department of Justice and in the halls of Congress, are trying to piece together what happened in the days before the bloody insurrection and attack on the Capitol. They are finding amazing text messages that floated between Mark Meadows and a host of people, including several Fox hosts. But the visitor logs are also potentially really revealing because visitor logs will tell you who came and went into the Oval Office and into the White House in the days before January 6th. We know from lots of good reporting from our Post colleagues work that Phil and I did, and from our competitors, a lot about the people who were getting inside the White House and inside the ear of Donald Trump in the days before January 6th. And a lot of them had devilish and conspiracy sounding ideas and theories. But the logs will be far more exhaustive, although there will be some gaps. And there's really very little legal ground for withholding those logs from the committee at this point, given that this is a congressional investigation trying to get to the bottom of potential crimes and make a criminal referral to the Justice Department.
Yeah, let me let you weigh in since she brought up the whether or not there would be a case to fight this. What do you think, Joyce?
So obviously there will be a case because Trump is all about using the courts to delay legal process from moving forward. The question, I think, is how the courts will respond. We've already had one Supreme Court ruling affirming Joe Biden's ability to exert executive privilege. They did reserve a little bit of authority to answer the question of when a former president can try to countermand a sitting president. But they concluded that because January 6th was so unique, it was important for Biden to have the authority to order the National Archives to turn these documents over. So the courts could process anything brought by the former president very quickly, just referring to that prior precedent and quickly wending this case on its way through the courts so that Congress can get access to these documents expeditiously. Of course, we know that our court system doesn't always move as quickly as one would hope or expect it would be able to. And that's a real question that we'll see. How does the judiciary handle this clear effort once it's filed to delay? Because it will have no substance to it.
So that's the logs. And Phil, today your paper detailed how important the text messages are to this investigation. And I wonder if you think maybe some of those kinds of documents that this committee has are just as, or maybe even more important than witness testimony. I mean, texts, for example, aren't subject to memory lapses.
That's exactly right, Chris. And texts not only show you, these records not only show you the exact messages, but they give you timestamps. So you're able to reconstruct, as our colleagues at the Washington Post did with this really masterful piece this morning, minute by minute, what sort of feedback the White House Chief of Staff was getting from some of the president's allies, including Sean Hannity, the Fox News host. And it helps paint a picture, I think, for investigators in Congress, how chaotic the scene was, but also how much forewarning White House officials, senior White House officials had about what would transpire on January 6th. It was clear that Hannity was very concerned in the 24 to 48 hours ahead of time about what could be happening on the 6th. And Meadows was receiving those messages even as the president was continuing to buckle down on his election lie and stoke some of his supporters on social media and elsewhere. And then, of course, at that speech at the Ellipse. So the text messages tell the story. It's sort of like the receipts, if it were, for what exactly was being communicated in that moment, minute by minute.
And even though we think we know so much, Joyce, and maybe you experienced this, but I certainly did as I was reading, as Phil said, that masterful story today, it really paints a detailed picture. And I wonder what, again, as you're looking to build a case, how the compilation of these texts inform us about how this committee is building its case.
I suspect that these aren't the most damaging texts that the committee has acquired. They're probably putting these out because they're demonstrative of some really significant information that they're digging up. I suspect we'll hear more when they hold their public hearings this summer, but just based on these, there's so much rich, detailed information that makes you want to dig further. And the Sean Hannity texts are a really great example of that, because he suggests a very specific concern he has, that everyone in the White House counsel's office is going to resign. And he suggests that that's because of the plan to pressure Mike Pence. He doesn't, these are texts, they're short. He doesn't say to pressure Pence into interfering with certifying the election, but that's the clear implication. I think it's safe to say that Sean Hannity probably didn't make that up out of whole cloth, because it's so specific, so pinpoint. One suspects that there were concerns ruminating inside of the White House counsel's office Those are the lawyers who represent the presidency. They don't represent a sitting president. They represent the presidency. And it's clear that there were concerns in that office that he was trying to articulate to Mark Meadows. One has to wonder how widespread was the knowledge of what was planned for January 6th and precisely what was planned, and who was in charge of the planning. Lots of follow-up here that could be done both by the January 6th committee to surface the truth, and perhaps as importantly, maybe more importantly, by federal prosecutors exploring whether there was a conspiracy at work here that should be charged.
You know what Joyce says, Carol, obviously raises the question, are there real bombshells that they have that they're withholding for the actual public hearings? And so the committee has all this evidence, all these documents. What's the next step? What should we be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
I think you're going to need to be mindful of the pieces that this committee is trying to put together. Joyce is a good prosecutor, and she knows exactly the game. It's a very tactical game. Withhold some of your most important material and also withhold things that you need to get nailed down and corroborated so you don't muddy the water. I think that some of the material here that you've seen in the post piece about the text, this cinematic detail of putting together who was pinging who in those hours before, there is still material in between those conversations to learn. And I bet the committee knows a good portion of it, but not all of it. I'd also highlight one particularly foreboding text in that great story by my colleagues. And that is the text from an unidentified member of the Freedom Caucus who says on about January 1, remember that's 5 days before the insurrection. This member is described by the investigative committee as someone who's very familiar with Donald Trump's planning for January 6th. And his text reads, if POTUS allows this to occur, we're driving a stake in the heart of the federal republic. Now, what exactly did that Freedom Caucus member mean by this? If it is as simple as pressuring Pence to reject the election results and the electors, it's a pretty prescient and interesting text. Committee members have either interviewed or learned information around this lawmaker and what he was saying to his staff, what he was saying to the White House, what he was saying to Meadows. But what else could this be? How grim and chilling a piece of information is this if this lawmaker knew something Donald Trump was plotting beyond what we all know now?
What did they know and when did they know it? All right, we could talk about this all night. It really is fascinating. If folks haven't read the story, they should. But Phil, I want to move on to Ukraine because there's a senior official who says not only has Russia not moved forces away from the border, they're actually adding troops. As you talk to folks at the White House, is the level of concern growing?
You know, Chris, there's been a heightened level of concern for weeks now about what Russia is doing. U.S. intelligence agencies, of course, are on top of this and are gathering intelligence to pinpoint where those troop movements are and game out sort of what to expect from Putin. But the wild card is Putin himself, and he has made sort of public declarations and sort of signaled in certain ways his motives, but we really don't know. And he's sort of holding his own cards here, and so he can of course signal that Russia's going to be pulling back its troops, but that doesn't necessarily mean the troops are being pulled back. And so what you see here in Washington and at the CIA and other intelligence agencies is a real focus on what do we actually see happening on the ground versus what is Putin saying and what are sort of Russian officials and Russian state media putting out there in terms of the narrative about a possible invasion into Ukraine. So clearly officials here on the U.S. side and of course in Western Europe, the leadership of the various NATO allies are continuing to be on alert for any kind of movement into Ukraine by the Russians.
And we're, as I said, going to do a deep dive with Ambassador Taylor on that in just a few minutes. But Joyce, I want to get your take on this Reuters report that New York Attorney General Letitia James responded to Donald Trump's 5-page letter defending his company's financial statements. So she files a letter with a state court, and here's part of what it said. It is truly rare for a party to publicly disagree with statements submitted by his own attorneys in a signed pleading, let alone one day after the pleading was filed. What is she really saying here about Trump's tactics?
Well, you know, Donald Trump has already been fired by his accountants this week. It looks like he's trying to double down and get fired by his attorneys, too. Because what happened here, you have to remember the context is about whether or not Tish James is going to get to depose Donald Trump and 2 of his adult children. And so the response that his lawyers filed in court with their names on the pleadings said, Donald Trump has no information relevant to these valuation issues on these statements that he can provide to Tish James in depositions. There's no reason he should be deposed. And he has contradicted his attorneys with so much specificity and detail in this written statement where he talks about valuation and says that he actually undervalued brand value and implies that there's a lot that he could offer in response to legitimate questions that Tish James has. And she has driven straight into that opening that he has given her, making the point to the court that Trump has really engaged in a self-own here, that he's made her case to depose him better than she ever could have. I think she's going to get those depositions scheduled.
We will see. Joyce Vance, Carol Leonnig, Philip Rucker on another fascinating night. Thanks to all of you. And coming up, more warnings from the White House.
The Russians, in the midst of all this is over the course of weeks and even recent days, have put additional forces on the border. So I want to be very clear. Our concern has not diminished an iota.
U.S. officials warn the threat of Russian military aggression has not passed, calling out Russia for lying about a troop pullback. And while the West anxiously waits and watches for the Kremlin's next verifiable move, the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius says Putin has a weak endgame. He writes, quote, Putin had seemed convinced a month ago that his ever-intensifying war of nerves over Ukraine was working to Russia's advantage. But White House officials believe this tactic might be backfiring. Some Russian officials are questioning Putin's brinkmanship, and Western nations, unsettled by Russian bullying, are rallying around a NATO alliance that appeared depleted just 2 years ago. Yet, as Russia adds more troops to the border, the U.S. remains on high alert.
We're in the window where we believe an attack could come at any time, and that would be preceded by a fabricated pretext that the Russians use as an excuse to launch an invasion. Claims of provocation in Donbass, false state media reports, which I think everybody should keep their eyes open and aware of that potential, faked videos, false accusations about chemical weapons, or accounts of attacks on Russian shoulders that have not actually occurred.
With us tonight, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. He is also the United States Institute of Peace Vice President for Russia and Europe. So happy that you could be here tonight. We've got a lot to talk about, Ambassador. Let's start with the senior administration official telling NBC that Russia has added as many as 7,000 troops to Ukraine's border. Do you agree with David Ignatius that Putin's moves aren't having the impact he wants, that in fact, the West is becoming more united against Russian aggression?
Chris, I do. I think David Ignatius is exactly right. I imagine that President Putin is surprised, dismayed, unsettled by the strong reaction that he's getting from a range of people on the other side of his border. That is, President Zelensky in the first instance. Here's President Zelensky, a fairly new politician. He'd never held office before. He's, 43 years old. President Putin, KGB, 20 years in his office, President Putin thought that he could dominate or intimidate or rattle President Zelensky. And President Zelensky has stood up. President Biden has stood up and has supported President Zelensky and has indicated that the sovereignty of Ukraine that President Zelensky continues to defend is not at issue, is not to be discussed, is not on the table. And as you said, and as David Ignatius said, the NATO alliance has undoubtedly surprised President Putin at the strength and the unity of its response. That NATO allies are unified in what they're trying to do. And that doesn't mean every NATO ally is doing exactly the same thing, but they're unified in the focus, in the direction that they are pushing. They're pushing back on Russia, they're supporting Ukraine, and they're defending the alliance.
So if indeed Vladimir Putin is unsettled, is an unsettled Vladimir Putin potentially a more volatile Vladimir Putin?
It's potentially more volatile, but I also think that he must be calculating costs and benefits. So this is not an irrational person. And the costs, when he looks at these, are heavy. The price he would pay for going across the border, of pulling that trigger, of sending all those troops, or even some of those troops across the border, would be very, very high, not just in terms of the sanctions that we've talked about for weeks. They would be hammering, they would be devastating to the Russian economy, sadly, to Russian people, just individuals who are trying to use their bank accounts or their credit cards or pay their bills. They would be hit immediately if we sanction the top 3 Russian banks. So that's the first thing, but that's not even the biggest thing. There could be sanctions on him, on President Putin. There will be sanctions on people around him, on their families, on their assets that they have in London or in Miami. They could be directly affected. The export ban, we haven't talked a whole lot about, but the export ban actually is a very powerful sanction. It means that small components, little microchips that they need, the Russians need for their weapons, for their smartphones, for their economy, would be cut off. They can probably find a couple of other sources, but not the same way as we can. Again, our alliance, including the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the Indians, not to mention all the Europeans, strongly support these sanctions. And so the work that the Biden administration has done to develop this alliance is really paying off. One of the other big prices that President Putin will pay if he invades is the potential for unrest in his own country. An invasion of Ukraine, an attack on Ukraine, is likely to be unpopular among Russians. The Russians think of Ukrainians as very close to them. Yeah. They think they're brothers and cousins. And all of a sudden, President Putin is going to be attacking them. And Russian soldiers, this is again sad to say, Russian soldiers are going to come back to be buried in Russian towns and villages, not to mention the tens of thousands of Ukrainians, military and civilian, that will be killed.
Can I ask you about the Ukrainian people, Ambassador, because they gathered today to celebrate Unity Day, meant to mark the day Russia was rumored to invade Ukraine. And our Richard Engel was there. I want to play what one Ukrainian told him about the current environment. Take a listen.
What do you think about what the United States is doing right now? The U.S. says every day, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Do you think they're overplaying it? Is it helpful? Is it making people nervous?
It makes people nervous, but it's helpful. So, yeah, it's aggressive. We are thankful to our allies in US and in Europe and for this strategy.
You like it?
No, I hate it, but it's something that saves me.
So you know the Ukrainian people, Ambassador, and we see them, they want to live in a democracy. So when you see those kinds of gatherings today, when you hear someone like that woman, what goes through your mind?
What goes through my mind, Chris, is the strength of the Ukrainian people. They've been living with this threat, with this fight, with this war in their east for 8 years. The Russians, as we know, invaded Ukraine in 2014, and the Russians have come across that border. They've annexed part of Ukraine, Crimea. The Ukrainian people have resisted. The Ukrainian military has resisted, has fought. The Ukrainian military is now battle hardened, as they say, Chris. They know how to fight these Russians. The Russian army is clearly bigger than the Ukrainian army. There's no doubt about that. But the Russian army has to come across the border into someone else's land. The Ukrainian army is defending their own. And you hear that determination in the voices of Ukrainian people. You heard it in that woman's voice. I was in Ukraine. I was in Kyiv 3 weeks ago. talk to many Ukrainians, talk to President Zelensky, talk to the ministers, talk to people on the street. They are determined. They're grimly determined. You heard that just in that clip that you just played from Richard. They are ready. They are preparing themselves. They're training to resist Russian occupiers. President Putin has alienated, has created on his border a hostile nation for generations.
Ambassador William Taylor, pleasure to have you on the program, sir. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Chris.
And coming up, the clear message